Much of our data is crossing a wireless network nowadays, so it's important that we know how to secure those networks. We're going to have that conversation starting right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus, where today we will be talking about wireless security. Unfortunately, I thought that, wireless, you implement wireless and life just got simple. But apparently it wasn't that easy. There's some problems and some issues that we need to address. And the good thing is that Wes is going to be the one to kind of drive us down that road and take us on that path. Wes, how's it going and where do we start?
Oh man, it's going great, and I guess we're going to start from what we use in order to secure our communications when it comes to the wireless networks, because like Dan says, we hook up those wireless networks and it does provide a lot of convenience, but as we've talked about, convenience and security, that is a fine line that we have to do that, or a balancing act, I should say. So let's go ahead and start out with, they call them cryptographic protocols. It's how we secure the networks. And one of the first ones we're going to talk about is one that I don't want to ever hear that you're using inside of your wireless networks. And this is what's known as the wired equivalent privacy. Came out in '99, so it's been around for a while. It was something that was really just released at the same time that the wireless protocol 802.11a was released. And it gave the equivalency, as you can see in the name, as a wired network. Now, if you are employing any encryption on a wired networks are not secure by default. So just keep that in mind. And it does have a lot of different things surrounding it that basically make it breakable. It's very weak. It is something that you shouldn't use. And one of the many things that it has problems with is that it uses what's known as a static key. All right, it uses a PSK, and we'll talk about those methods coming up. Just think of it as a password, a passphrase, if you will. And that key never changes. All right, and there's a problem in security with things that are static, right? We like lots of things to be ephemeral, right? Change, some kind of change, or rotation, right? It's one of the reasons we talk about passwords. Think about your password management in general, right? There's a reason we put a password policy that defines complexity, but it also defines how long you can use a password before you have to change it, right? Well, if you do that for humans, right, you would want to do that for your networks as well, too. So it uses very relatively weak keys too, 164 and 128 bits. Now, the other thing about the wired equivalent privacy, or WEP, is it used what's known as the RC4 stream cipher. And remember, we've talked about in cryptography, we've talked about what stream ciphers are. And RC4 is one of those ones that at the time it wasn't bad, but it's certainly not something that should be used today. That comes from Ron Rivest, or Rivest cipher, Rivest code. He's the R in RSA encryption, if you will. And it also uses what's known as a CRC checksum, right? Checksums, think about what we've talked about, message digest. CRC is just cyclic redundancy check. It's a 32-bit value. Now, just doing a little bit of math here, we were joking around because Dan's getting ready to dive into some security and security type training, that it's all about math, right? But if you look at a 32-bit, so this is easy West math here, 32-bit checksum, deduct that from your key, right? And that's what you're left with when it comes to the strength of the actual key. So the keys are relatively weak. And the problem with the checksum is all it would do is tell you that a packet or a frame that came across to wireless communication it has maintained its integrity. But here's the problem with that. It's susceptible to replay attacks because you can modify the CRC to basically say whatever you want, and then the endpoint doesn't really know and is none the wiser that this has been modified. So again, just keep that in mind. Wired equivalent privacy is not something you should be using on your networks. And while it isn't formally called out by the objectives, I wouldn't be surprised if you don't see it on the exam as in a list of answers. And I want you to know that when they talk about you need strong encryption, this shouldn't be one that you're choosing as an answer.
All right, so now we know for a fact, WEP, bad. We will smack your hand if you use it. Right. So don't do that unless you're doing some sort of testing for those only specific purposes. And what we want to look for is something with, nosebleed-inducing mathematical algorithms under the hood. Give us a little more strength.
Sure.
What's the next algorithm that we would want to be prepared for?
Absolutely. So if we go up the ramp a little bit when it comes to strength, is the next one. Again, the Wi-Fi Alliance knew that WEP was it wasn't really a good encryption encryption. In fact, there were proprietary encryption methods that were coming out, like, for instance, LEAP. LEAP is the lightweight extensible authentication protocol that Cisco made, and what they would do is they would basically do a key rotation on every single packet, but that was proprietary to Cisco. Well, the Wi-Fi Alliance said, hey, we need something now, so what they came up with is what is known as Wi-Fi Protected Access, or WPA. Now, given the fact that this is also an old protocol, it's also relatively weak, and it shouldn't really be used. So I caution you against using it, especially for anything that is truly sensitive information. It might be something that you're trying to do a little bit of due diligence. Maybe you just want to say, hey, I've got some form of encryption here, but it's pretty weak. So I use that term, some form of encryption, very loosely, in the fact that that's about all you're getting. Now, what it did over WEP is it did this thing where it would do a per packet encryption. And what I mean by that is temporal key integrity protocol. What it would do is it would wrap every frame or every packet come across a wireless network with a new key. All right, temporal, ephemeral, right? We're getting a little better, right? Because it's changing, but it also has some problems. And the other thing, too, one of its problems is it was still using the underlying RC4 stream cipher, but they went a little bit farther, and rather than having that small, and you know, I made a mistake here. I said it was, the WEP was a 32-bit CRC. It's actually 24-bit. And again, I was thinking, because if you take 24 off of 64, I was like, wait a second, it was only a 50-bit key. It was actually a 24-bit CRC value on WEP.
You were giving it credit.
Absolutely. I was giving a little bit more credit.
Wes is trying to, like, yeah, maybe it's not so bad. It is.
It is. So what they did here is they said, all right, we're going to make what's known as a MIC, or a message integrity check. All right. It's the same concept, ladies and gentlemen. It says basically, but now we're going to have a 48-bit checksum at the end, and it did give a little bit more strength to it. But at the end of the day, do keep in mind that with WPA, Wi-Fi protected access, due to the fact that it's been around a lot for a long time, the computational power of our computers today, this one's relatively weak as well and should really be avoided.
Wes, I'm going to applaud your teaching brilliance, because he's done a phenomenal job. Because you got to remember, when it comes to security, it's not always about what you do. It could be what you don't do as well. And using these two different protocols is definitely something you should not be doing. So great counter examples. We shouldn't do those. Let's get into those that we should be using. I'm thinking some WPA2 might be in order.
You got it, absolutely. You know your protocols. WPA2 right now is what I would say is it's Wi-Fi protected access. Again, it's the version 2. This is also known as 802.11i or 802.11i. I don't have that in the graphic, but I want you to be aware of it, the IEEE standard. Remember 802.11, while this isn't really a networking course in general, I would definitely have a passing familiarity with the 802.11 standards, especially when it comes to Wi-Fi protected access 2 and that 802.11i standard. Now, you might ask yourself, well, wait a second, why is it called Wi-Fi protected access 2 and why is it called 802.11i? Well, the Wi-Fi Alliance came to the IEEE and said, hey, we need something now. We can't wait. So they released what they had at the time, and that formed the basis for WPA. When they formally standardized and finished the entire package, they released it out as 802.11i, the IEEE did. But because of the marketing that had already gone and been associated with WPA, the Wi-Fi Alliance said, okay, well, we're just going to call it WPA2. They're the same protocol, don't worry about that, but I do want to make you aware of that. This is a lot stronger, if you will, because it uses something known as CCMP, and it does away with TKIP, the Temporal Key Integrity Protocol. This uses something known as the counter mode cipher block chaining message authentication code protocol. No, you do not need to know that for the exam, but basically underlying what this is using is the Advanced Encryption Standard, AES, if you will. And we've talked about AES. Remember that AES 256, that is the formal encryption standard for U.S. military's top secret documents. Now, this uses 128-bit encryption key, and I want you to be aware of that as well. So WPA2, I will tell you, today really should be the least of your security. All right, and it's long been the standard that we use to secure our wireless networks when it comes to the cryptographic protocol choices that you make.
Yeah, it's crazy that Wes is sitting here telling you this is the least amount of security you should be adding to your wireless devices, because it wasn't that long ago that this was the the apex predator when it came to wireless security. But that's no longer the case. We have now moved on. We've gotten it bigger, stronger, faster with WPA3 now, right?
That's right. I don't know if it's twice as strong. It's probably not twice as strong, but when we talk about WPA3, it's exactly what Dan said. It's the third version of the Wi-Fi protected access. It is really the strongest one on the market, and if you have the choice to implement it, I would recommend implementing it. However, side note, remember the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability? This will definitely take care of the first two, but it might run counter to the last one. And the availability part, what do I mean by that? Because this is using a very strong encryption method. In fact, the weakest encryption that this uses is the AES 128-bit with CCMP. That's the weakest encryption you can use in this standard. The enterprise level, you have to make sure that the devices that you use to connect to your wireless network support that, and that could be an issue. So it uses something known as SAE, and I'm going to tell you what the acronym means and explain a little bit about it. However, I don't want you to get too hung up on the acronym. It's simultaneous authentication of equals. And what this does is it's using, and we're going to talk about the difference between personal mode and enterprise mode, so just bear with me on this. I'm going to come back to that. What it does in personal mode is it uses AES 128-bit encryption with CCMP. In the enterprise mode, it uses what's the equivalent of a 192-bit encryption key, and behind the scenes, I believe it's AES 256 that it's using with a Galius counter mode. Again, not something you have to know, just really the whole point of that is it's very, very strong encryption. And as we move towards the future, you're going to see where WPA2 is probably going to do just like the other ones did, kind of fall away, go to the way of the dodo bird, and this will become the kind of like the de facto standard for wireless encryption cryptographic protocols.
Yeah, I like how you pointed out how that kind of tends to be the ebb and flow of working with these technologies. You're always kind of backwards supporting things that are less secure,
Yes.
which makes your networks less secure. So it's good to try to get up to speed as fast as you possibly can to eliminate that window of opportunity for attackers. Well, let's move on, Wes, because you need to talk about some authentication protocols that are kind of important to the conversation around wireless, right?
Most definitely. And the great thing is, if you remember in our cryptography section, one of the things that we talked about, we had already talked about authentication protocols, but I didn't tell you exactly where they fit. And I want to just go ahead and mention them here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them because you've seen these. Remember extensible authentication protocol? Remember that it's a framework that we talked about for moving or transporting authentication mechanisms. PEEP relies on certificates, and you have to have a certificate on the client, you have to have a certificate on the connecting device that you're connecting to, if you will, and what it does is it's protected EAP is what it stands for, and it establishes an encrypted tunnel before the communication even happens. So that's what PEEP is. And then we have a series of other ones. EAP Fast we have talked about, and the EAP TLS as well as EAP TTLS, and again, we definitely touched pretty good on these inside of our cryptographic protocols when we talked about that in the cryptography section, but know that those protocols specifically, they do sit right here, and I want you to be aware of that, and I want you to associate those with wireless communication. It's not so much that I want you to study things twice, but know where they fit in the ecosystem of your network communications, because as a security professional, that's going to be important.
Yeah, and no conversation around wireless would be complete without talking about authentication and how you do that. Not necessarily just the protocols themselves, but how do I tell the wireless system that, hey, I'm in the in crowd. I should have access to this. Authentication is how we work with that, but that shows itself in different and sundry ways, Wes, right?
It does, and one of the easiest methods of authentication that we have is what's known as a pre-shared key, and we've talked about this. You've heard Dan make mention. I like Dan said very early on in this series, and if you're not aware of this, definitely go back and watch some of those earlier shows. He said it's essentially like a password. That's essentially what it is. They call it a passphrase, but all it means is that it is a pre-shared value that you have to have on both ends in order to join the network. That's your pre-shared key. Be aware of what that is, and I kind of give you a snapshot of a WRT interface where you would set that. Notice it says password right there. So you might hear it called PSK. This is an authentication. It's one of the most basic authentication methods, and prior to WPA3, personal would allow you the ability to set up the personal mode, if you would allow you to set up a pre-shared key. But there's also, unlike pre-shared key, there's also what's known as enterprise level mode. And when we talk about enterprise level mode, remember we've talked about some of these components before. We talked about 802.1x. Enterprise level mode is where you bring in, again, a lot more infrastructure and you're coupling, if you will, kind of a layered defense system with an 802.1x compliant access point or a wireless LAN controller and a radius server. And that's where the enterprise mode comes in because, again, it's going to be a higher level of security, but it's also going to require a lot more infrastructure, hence the name enterprise mode. You can see that right here. If you put it in WPA2 enterprise, then you also have to point your clients to the radius server where they're going to do radius-based authentication. Remember, that's the remote access dial-in user service. If you're not familiar with that, definitely go back and check out those episodes, but understand that what's happening is when the wireless client joins the network, the access point acts like the authenticator, and it kind of closes the port down and says, hold on a second, let me go talk to somebody in the back room here for you and make sure you're supposed to be here. That back room, if you will, being where this doesn't have to really be the back room, but that's the radius server. Radius server sends some challenges through back to the client. If you're accepted, authenticate, the port opens up and now you can join the wireless network. That's important to remember. A couple other ones I want you to be aware of too. This is one that came out and I really shouldn't really be using this one either. This is called Wi-Fi protected setup.
I'm sorry.
That's right.
They literally tried to invent the easy button for Wi-Fi.
They did.
And then they forgot all about that scale with ease and security. And there you go.
Most definitely. You see this. This is an 8-digit PIN, and basically what you'll do is you'll have to be in the physical location of the device because you'll push a button on the router or on the wireless access point, and then you're going to put the device PIN in here. And basically what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to be push button security. Push button security. While it was had great intentions, the outcomes weren't really weren't great outcomes. If
The
you will.
road to hell is paved with what?
With great intentions, that's right. So the other thing I want to mention here, and I don't really have a slide for it, is what's called open authentication, which is kind of a funny thing because it really isn't any authentication. And when they say, if they say open authentication method, what that means is my client, my wireless, let's say wireless laptop here, is going to say, hey, access point, I want to join your network. Authentication accepted. Join the network. All right. I didn't have to put anything in, so it isn't really a secure method. But you'd have to know what open authentication means. It's really the lack of authentication. Final thing that I want to talk about here that they mention here. You probably, if you've ever gone to any kind of convention, you ever gone to a hotel, you've probably seen one of these captive portal. Just know what that means. It means that you're going to have to, before you can actually join the wireless network, it's more like a due diligence thing because it just means that you're going to put in your username and your password and an access code. It could be, I know that in hotels that I've been, it's been like your room number, if you will. And then they put essentially an acceptable use policy. They call it terms and conditions, but a lot of times it's an acceptable use policy of what you can and can't are not supposed to do on their wireless network, and then they can hold you liable for it. And at least whoever the company is that's providing, like I said, a lot of times hotels, before they have to do this for their own liability. So know what the captive portal is, as well as an authentication method. It means I lock you down. You go to the captive portal. You put in your username and password, your access code. Agree to the terms and conditions. If you put everything in right, you click connect, and it allows you to connect the wireless network.
Now, Wes, there's a couple of other things that we need to take into account when it comes to wireless security that might not fit in a neat little box, like we'd say authentication or things of that nature, but are nonetheless very important to the security of your wireless systems, right?
Yeah, and that really comes down to things like installation considerations. One of the first things that they mention is this thing called channel overlay. I love these technical terms. Let's go ahead and put it in English. That just means channel overlap, overlay, if you will. And what this means is really about congestion. All right. In the 2.4 gigahertz network, you have essentially 13 channels. You have 11 that are used here in the United States. The 12th channel can be used in things like the European countries, and the only one that uses the entire 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, 13 channels, is Japan. However, in those 11 channels, there are 3 that do not overlap their bandwidth, if you will, and that's 1, 6, and 11. So just be aware of that. If you do a site survey, which we're going to see here, talk about it in a second, basically you will find all the other access points that are within the range of your network. And if you see access points on, a lot of times they'll default to channel 6. If you have every single access point in proximity of your AP on channel 6, there's a good chance you're going to have a lot of channel congestion, and it can really cause, like, for instance, performance issues within your network. Now, the other thing, too, is the wireless access point placement. One of the things that, Dan, I think it was in our physical security episode, Dan joked around, "Ooh, what's this? I'm going to walk out with it." And really, you have to be careful because wireless access points need to be strategically placed. You'll see them a lot of times in buildings where they put them in the roof. And like, for instance, in our building, you can't, unless you get out a 12-foot ladder, you can't even get to our wireless access points. And that is a common practice, right? We don't want to just put these in the break room because, remember, a lot of times these access points, you put it in a break room, it's got a little 4-port switch on the back of it, and I could potentially connect to it. And if I can connect to your network, it is no longer your network. So just be familiar with that. Other things are the heat maps and site surveys. Again, a heat map is just a way that you can tell the strength of your network in gain or decibels, if you will, and it just shows you what the coverage is of your access point, especially if you have like a distributed or one of these mesh-based networks where you have multiple access points working in concert with each other. The other thing about the wireless access point placement, too, is not always just about the security, but also making sure that you get the greatest coverage. Because I think the last one would really lend itself to, hey, physical barriers. Remember, if you cannot put this in some place where people cannot, it's out of their reach, make sure you use things like data centers, right? Make sure that you've got some kind of lock and key. And same thing with your controllers, because remember, a wireless LAN controller, first of all, they can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So chances are you're going to have one of these if you do in some kind of data center. But make sure that they're secure, because remember, if somebody has physical access to your network, they can pretty much do what they want.
Yeah, that's something you want to look out for and not partake in. But cool thing is that, Wes, you happen to have a little bit of a show and tell for us to take a look at, right? So you're going to kind of take a walk around the block when it comes to some wireless security settings. I can't wait to see that.
All right, so the first thing I want to kind of show you guys and gals out there is a Wi-Fi analyzer and some of the things that you can use it, because it is one of the tools when they talk about installation considerations and stuff. Let me show you here. So I'm using just the one that you can get right off of Microsoft, out of the Microsoft store. And what we're seeing here is we're actually seeing the IT Pro TV network. You can see that it's operating in the 5 gigahertz range. Notice that the 802.11 standard, as well as the fact that it is running our WPA2. Notice that it's pre-share key and some of those concepts that we've talked about, the I almost said ACS, not ACS. How about AES? We'll try the acronym right, and CCMP. And we can see what the strength is, right? It lets me know when we do things like site surveys, well, what's the strength of the network? Now, notice that this says hidden, too. Yeah. Hidden is when the basic service set identifier is not being broadcast. However, security alert, it's right there. And we essentially can still see that information. We don't see the human name, if you will, the human readable name like JR Companies here, but I can still see essentially what is the MAC address, right? That essentially is the service set identifier. And again, it's good to see, just the strengths if you're doing site surveys. The other thing I want to show you too is, remember when we talked about channel overlays? So here is the 2.4 gigahertz network. And one of the things that you're going to notice here is that, notice how they've got channel 1, they've got channel 6, and channel 11 down here, like I said. And they're kind of darkened out. And the reason is that's because a lot of times they default. However, somebody else has to figure it out. Well, there's going to be a lot of congestion, right? You can see we've got a lot of access points here, and they're just defaulting to the default channels. But we do have some that have auto and have either been statically set, or I might even say that they're doing auto kind of sensing, and they're switching back and forth. And you can leave that in the interface like that. You don't have to really worry about that on the 5 gigahertz network, because the channel width might be bigger, but you have a lot more space in between those channels. And one of the great things about the 5 gigahertz base network is with the technology is antennas can figure out, hey, there's somebody else that's on this. Let's go ahead and automatically move you over to another one, another channel as well. So a little bit, just kind of show you that. The other thing I got here in the background is an actual wireless interface that we can kind of take a look at. And we're going to go ahead and just kind of sign in. And when we sign in, what I'd like to do is go right down here to the wireless settings. And when we choose the wireless settings, you'll see here a couple of the things that we've talked about, right? Notice it's the 2.4 gigahertz network. There's your PSK, the pre-shared key. Notice that it's WPA2 personal. That's where we get that password or that PSK. However, if I choose to edit this, I can change this, right? Here's that service set identifier. I'll tell you, you might want to change it to something that isn't the default, because if you leave the default SSID and this guy's out here on your network and he's going to do some penetration testing on it, he knows what that default SSID is. He can just plug that into a web browser and say, oh, this is a Linksys router, and guess what? It's a Linksys 1900X running AC.
And I'm going, someone likes defaults.
That's right.
I wonder what the default credentials are.
That's right. So change those defaults. That's all a part of the wireless security here. Now notice the personal. If I switch this over to WPA2 Enterprise, now it's saying, all right, well, that's great. But now what I need you to do is give me the port, right? So I would have to know where the IP address of the server, and I'd say something like 1812. That's the port radius port that we're going to connect to. So you can see some of these things that you can do. The other thing that I didn't really mention that I'm just going to take a brief second to talk about. Here's Wi-Fi protected setup, and let me not change the settings here. Notice that this is on. One of the first things I would do is disable this, as well as there's also MAC filtering here too. MAC filtering does exactly what it sounds like. You can either do it by an allow or a deny list, whitelist or blacklist. Says these are the MAC addresses that I allow on this network. This is not a way to secure your wireless network, because MAC addresses can be spoofed very, very easily. It's the operating system that's telling the wireless access point, oh yeah, this is your MAC address. Well, if I can get a piece of software that says, no, operating system, this is my MAC address, right? We can go out there and we can set a wireless analyzer in what's known as promiscuous mode, so it will look at all of the wireless packets coming off of a network, and we can just find a legitimate MAC address for your network, and we could spoof it and make our way onto the network. So this is not something that you want to use, but I do want you to be aware of it for your Security Plus exam.
Well, Wes, that was either the ramblings of a craven madman, or you're the most brilliant son of a gun I know. And that's great stuff when it comes to wireless security, knowing all about the concepts, what we need to know as far as the encryption standards that are being used, authentication methods. But not only that, but what it looks like to put that into practice, kind of walk around the access points, abilities. What can I enable? What should I enable? How should I be working with this in a secure way? That's super helpful for all of us out there. Well, it looks like it is that time again for us to call it a day, but there is more in our Security Plus series, so we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, everyone, have yourself a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.